Welcome to IFA. I fix everything.
Today's project is to replace a worn brake hose on a 1986 Pontiac Fiero GT. The brake line is heavily rusted and will make it a challenge to remove it without damage. The first step in removing any rusted component is to apply penetrating oil and give it time for the chemical process to take place. To ensure I got complete coverage, I applied the penetrating oil to an acid brush and scrubbed it into the joints. I used a flare nut tubing wrench to test the joint and to allow the oil to seep deeper into the connections. With two flare nut tubing wrenches attached to the hose joint, I tried pressure in both directions with no events. The connection at the hose showed no signs of giving loose, so I turned my attention to the joint at the T-block. A lubricated fitting, a flare nut tubing wrench, and a hammer, and it still wouldn't come free. The wrench was turning, it was slipping on the nut. This video was part of a complete brake overhaul series. The master cylinder was drained during the brake removal process. I made several attempts at tightening, loosening, nothing worked. I brought out some flame. Keep in mind that using a torch is a last resort. The T-block contained no brake fluid. The rear brake line had been removed and replaced during the previous video. I heated the T-block with a MAP gas bottle, and then I attempted to tap it free with a hammer and a flare nut tubing wrench. I noticed it was rounding over the nut, so I stopped. Because the tubing flare seats to the T-block, I started back with a new plan. I was going to heat the tubing also to free the tubing from the union and the T-block. After the second heating attempt, including the line, the union moved immediately. But the line was still partially seated, so I seesawed the union back and forth to break free the seated line. The union was able to seesaw it back and forth without twisting the line, but it was still binding, so I applied a second coat of penetrating oil and let it soak in with the heat. Now the union began to move much more freely, and I exercised it some more until I felt comfortable, and then I unscrewed it all the way. With the brake line disconnected from the T-block, I unscrewed the clamp supporting the brake hose. To allow me to work at bench height, I removed the brake hose clip from the shock absorber. I clamped the brake hose as an assembly in a large bench vise. Take the screwdriver, pry up the two ears of the clip, and then pull it forward with a cotter pin extractor. To determine if the line was worth saving, I took it over to the bench grinder with a wire wheel and cleaned it up. I cleaned the flare nuts and the tubing to make sure the tubing still had its integrity and that the flare nut would rotate freely. So far, the line seems salvageable, but I still need to remove the hose. With the threads cleaned up, it's back to the bench vise and more penetrating oil to try to get this free. Bench vise, hammer, tapping and seesaw, no. Time for more heat. Nope, I found a better trick. I flipped it upside down, clamped the small line in the vise, and used a large flare nut tubing wrench on the line, tapping it forward and backwards until it broke free. It came apart relatively easily, without the risk of twisting off the tubing. The flare nut is seized. To reuse this line, it must be rotating freely. I cleaned the nut and the flare with the wire wheel and then soaked it in penetrating oil once again. Now I've carefully clamped the line in the vise supported on the wire wrap. Now I'm trying to gently nudge the flare nut free from the seat. I'm back to the wire wheel to burnish the tube and get the flare nut to rotate freely. Now I'm removing the corrosion from the bracket. To further clean the bracket in areas I was unable to get to, I'm soaking it in some muriatic acid. I even dipped the tips of the tube and soaked the line fittings in the muriatic acid. I did a little experiment. I set the line in a plastic bag and poured some muriatic acid in and used the handles to joggle it around and agitate the fluid. I was able to soak the tube, the bracket, and the hardware in the plastic bag. This allowed me to soak the tube without the need for a large jar and a large amount of fluid. I pre-assembled the tubing assembly on the workbench and then installed it as a unit with just one bolt. I hung the line on the fender well bracket loosely as I started the tubing into the T-block. After the brake line was tightened to the T-block, I tightened the mount bolt for the brake hose. Then I installed the banjo bolt with a crush washer on each side of the brake hose. Before tightening the banjo bolt, I installed the mount bolt to the shock absorber. The last step is inspect the hose for kinks prior to torquing the bolts to specification. The brake hose clip is 13 foot-pounds. The brake hose banjo bolt, also known as the flow bolt, is 32 foot-pounds. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and share. Remember, subscribers are always welcome.